Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar of crossing the US-Canada border under the Trump administration. We're going to give our guests and listeners a few more minutes to join during this lunch hour. Grab your lunch, get a drink, get cozy and comfortable. We've got some good information to share. Okay, we have some guests joining. We'll give everyone another minute and a half, and we look forward to a fun conversation about crossing the US-Canada border this afternoon and all things under the Trump administration, including work permits, green cards, and best practices for crossing the border. Okay, everyone, it is noon. We know some guests are still joining our webinar about crossing the US-Canada border today. I'm Jennifer Behm. I'm a partner with Berardi Immigration Law. Thanks for joining us. And I'm joined today with my colleague, Zach Ahlstrom.
Hi, everyone. Zach Ahlstrom. I'm a senior associate here at Berardi Immigration Law. We're excited to have you here and discuss current trends in immigration.
That's right. Berardi Immigration Law is a business and family-based immigration law firm. We are located and headquartered in Buffalo, New York, just 15 minutes from one of the busiest northern ports of entry between the US and Canada. So for our Canadian listeners today, we've got a ton of great information about crossing the border under the Trump administration, and let's dive in. So Zach, let's start off by acknowledging all of the media stories and these headlines that we are seeing coming out sometimes multiple times a day. It feels like there's been a noticeable uptick in the coverage surrounding all issues at the US border, particularly with respect to delays and secondary inspections. Overall, there's a sense of increased scrutiny, and many travelers, even those with valid visas and green cards, are finding the process more unpredictable. What are your thoughts? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so there's definitely an uptick in the number of stories that are coming out discussing U.S. immigration. And a lot of the headlines are about sort of horror stories and issues that people are facing at the border or with U.S. immigration in general. And, you know, I will say a lot of it is just headlines. There's a lot of underlying issues that aren't being discussed or addressed in a lot of these media stories by some of these news outlets. So it's very important to do your research and really get the facts straight about the situation before making any determinations or judgments, because you know, a lot of these horror stories could have been prevented. A lot of these issues that people are experiencing could have been prevented. There's a lot of underlying issues that typically result in immigration issues, especially at the U.S. border. And those details aren't being publicized along with the stories themselves.
That's right. Often the media doesn't have availability of all of those specific nuances that play into CBP's inspection of someone coming into the U.S. And we find when we're getting inundated with all of these calls, Canadians often assume they have this automatic right to being able to spend 180 days or 6 months in the US as a visitor. And I know around here in our office, we've dubbed this as the myth of the 180-day rule. In fact, we have a blog post on this topic at BerardiImmigrationLaw.com. We call this a myth because admission and period of stay is not an absolute guarantee to the US just because you're a Canadian citizen. CBP ultimately has the full discretion as to whether they're going to admit anyone, including Canadians, as a visitor to the US, and for how long. They're going to inspect every individual traveler and consider the admission request by a retired snowbird very differently from a young working professional. So Zach, tell us about some of the factors that CBP officers consider when they're inspecting and determining the admission of a visitor to the United States.
Yeah, I mean, so the number one thing is your intent. When you're traveling to the United States as a visitor, you're acknowledging to U.S. Customs that your trip is temporary and that you maintain the intent to depart. So this is the number one thing that a CBP officer is trying to determine when you show up at the border and you're traveling to the U.S. for either business visitor activities or for leisure activities. And one of the easiest, the simplest ways to protect yourself and sort of demonstrate to an officer that your intent is temporary is to travel prepared. So if you're flying, that means traveling with a round trip plane ticket. If you're driving, have evidence that backs up your story. So if you're going on vacation and you're traveling to Orlando, maybe you're going to Disney World, have proof of this, have documentation that's going to sort of demonstrate to the officer that, your story makes sense. And at the end of the day, that's really what it needs to do. Your story needs to make sense, and you have to be prepared to explain it and demonstrate evidence if you're asked. Some of the factors that, can lead to issues, especially when traveling as a business visitor, are going to be the frequency of your trips, the length of stay. Even if you truly are entering as a visitor and going for meetings, you're traveling to a U.S. office to visit your team or clients. If you're traveling once a week or multiple times a month, or if you're traveling for, months at a time or weeks at a time, these are situations that can commonly lead to issues at the border, simply because, officers start to get suspicious of what you're actually doing in the U.S. And if you're a younger working professional and you're traveling to the border and you're saying that you're going for meetings and it's a month-long stay, that's going to raise red flags because an officer is going to assume that you're going to be working while you're there. So at the end of the day, you need to make sure that your trips make sense, and that you're abiding by what, a visitor is truly supposed to do in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a great point. And a reminder to our listeners that the burden of proof is always on the individual who's requesting that admission. So Zach, when you have someone, especially a business professional, who is frequently crossing the border and they're starting to feel the heat a little bit more by CBP and getting some more questions, when would you advise that individual to contact an immigration attorney and go to get a work permit or visa?
Yeah, I mean, there's really you can't do it too early. It's better to be proactive in situations like this to help prevent issues with customs in the first place, and also safeguard your ability to travel as a visitor. So if you have a lot of upcoming, business travel to the U.S., or you've already started to get pushback at the border from U.S. Customs, that's a perfect time to reach out and just get some information about what you can do to safeguard yourself and make it easier to travel. Because if you get a work permit, if you find a category that you're eligible for and you obtain the work permit, it's going to significantly reduce potential issues at the border, and it's going to make traveling to the U.S., much easier in general. Even if you are just coming for business meetings or business visitor activities, that doesn't rule out the possibility of getting a work permit.
Right. Yeah. And I love what you said about you can't do it too early. There's so much truth behind that because it's a lot easier to request work authorization before CBP or a government officer stops you and say, hey, you shouldn't be doing this, rather than being reactive to them denying someone entry and saying, go get a work permit. Then you come back and the government's defense is already up against you. So great tip. Let's dive in and discuss some of the possible categories for work authorization, especially those that we consider most often for our Canadian clients. We have a huge practice being Northern Border practitioners. Berardi Immigration Law's attorneys know very much what the government is looking for in terms of trends when our clients apply. So let's talk about some of these options. Where would you start when a Canadian reaches out and says, hey, I need to work in the US. This is the job offer that I have.
Yeah, so just one other quick point about deciding when to get a work permit. The worst thing that you can do is repeatedly attempt entry if you start having issues with customs. If you go to the border and you start getting pushback and they're telling you that, you might need a work permit in order to enter in the future, you really don't want to push your luck, because that's when it's going to spiral out of control. And CBP officers have a lot of discretion. They have the ultimate right to refuse you entry. And if you tick them off, they can make your life very difficult in terms of traveling to the U.S. in the future. So
that and border hopping.
Exactly.
That's a big no-no, right, mm-hmm. Zach? Explain what border hopping is, because that's another.
So border hopping, right? It's essentially the concept of testing your luck at different ports of entry. Mm-hmm. So if you were to travel down to the Buffalo port of entry at the Peace Bridge and you have an issue with customs there, and you were to, get back in your car and go over to Lewiston or another port of entry in the area and try to enter there, hoping that you'd get a different outcome, you're going to be flagged. They're going to know that you just tried to enter at the Peace Bridge in Buffalo, and they're not going to be happy about it. Those are situations that generally result in a lot of pushback and can spiral out of control very quickly.
That's right. So going back, let's say someone was advised to get a work permit and we have a Canadian national. What are you going to start with? Which category?
Yeah, so there's a few categories that we would assess immediately. I would say the TN is probably the first option that we're going to look at. So the TN category in general is a special work permit category for citizens of Canada and Mexico. And the TN itself there's about 63 to 70-ish occupations that qualify for this type of work permit. And the eligibility criteria themselves are very straightforward. You need a job offer from a U.S. employer. You need to be entering to perform work in one of the eligible occupations, and you have to have the requisite credentials for this position. And one of the nice things about this category is that the regulations explicitly detail the credentials that are needed for each of these occupations. Mm-hmm. And most of the time, it's a bachelor's degree. So if we have a young professional in Canada that comes to us, they have a job offer from a U.S. entity, we see that they have a bachelor's degree, our immediate thought is going to be, can we make this work for a TN? That's going to be a great option, because the TN is beneficial in that you can apply at the border, you get immediate decisions, and you can require or request a 3-year work permit up front. So it's a great option for Canadians. Another category that we look at is going to be the L1. The L1 category is utilized by multinational companies. So if you're an employee with a Canadian company, you've been working for that company for at least a year, you could be eligible for an L1 work permit, which can be utilized to transfer to a U.S. office and provide services in the United States. The types of employees that are going to fall under this L1 category are going to be executives, managers, specialized knowledge employees. And similar to the TN, it's also very beneficial to Canadians because you can apply right at the border. You get those instant decisions on the spot by U.S. Customs, and you can also request a 3-year work permit up front. So there's some longevity, there's a quick turnaround, and it's going to provide you with the ability to work and also make traveling to the U.S. much easier.
That's right. We also practice a lot of E2 and E1 visa cases as well, Zach. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about those two categories?
Yeah, so the E1 and E2 are great options for Canadians. The E2 itself is called the Treaty Investor Visa, and this is based on a substantial investment in a U.S. business. So if you're a Canadian business owner or an entrepreneur, you can invest in the startup of a U.S. company. You can buy into an existing U.S. company, and this E2 visa is going to allow you to enter the United States for work. Another benefit of the E2 is that the U.S. entity that you're investing in gets registered as an e-visa business. And this registration allows for future sponsorship of additional employees. The E2 is issued in 5-year increments, so it's got more longevity than the TN in the L1. But the application process is a little different. It's not as an immediate turnaround as the TN or the L1. So with the E2, right, you have to apply at the consulate in Toronto. There's some lead up time. There's some processing times, but it's nothing significant. It's not 10, 12 months of waiting. It's usually a 2 to 3, maybe 4 month turnaround at most. But if you're eligible for an E2, it does offer advantages over like that L1, for example, because of the longevity and because of that company registration. It's going to make transferring employees to the U.S. very easy.
Very good. So for any listeners today who might be interested in one of these work authorization options, please don't hesitate to reach out to us through our website. We're happy to offer a complimentary initial screening for your business situation and border crossing details to see if you might qualify for one of these categories. So use the QR code that is on your screen for the webinar to send an inquiry through our website, and one of our team members will definitely get back to you to collect some more information and help you navigate this system. So Zach, we're starting to get some questions in. Let's move over to individuals who already hold work authorization or a visa or even a green card. We are getting inundated these days, especially again with the media frenzy and the headlines about border crossing disasters. And we're getting a lot of calls from our clients who already have lawful status or work authorization in the US. So they've done everything the right way. They got a visa, they have their work approval, and in many cases, some of them even hold a green card. But with all of the media stories right now that are circulating, they're really afraid to travel internationally. They hear stories of CBP being aggressive at reentry. How do we put the nerves of these clients at ease? And I do recognize that our advice is going to be different for a non-immigrant visa holder, like someone who holds TN authorization, L1, e-visa, even an H-1B, versus LPR travel. So let's start with some non-immigrant travel tips.
Yeah, I mean, so the number one travel tip for anyone with a non-immigrant visa, Canadians with a work permit, is you want to travel prepared, and you want to make sure that you have the right documentation to address any concerns that could potentially be raised by U.S. Customs at the border. To put some nerves at ease, I will say people that have done everything the right way, they've obtained a work permit, they're maintaining the terms and conditions of their status in the U.S. There haven't been any material changes to their employment that was disclosed in the underlying petition. You really should be, for the most part, fairly okay traveling. It's just a matter of having the right documentation, keeping your story straight, and not misrepresenting anything or anything that you're doing in the United States. A lot of the stories that you see in the media now with people that are having issues, it's primarily because there were underlying issues or some inconsistencies in their story that, for the most part, are going to lead to these types of immigration consequences. And it's been happening. This isn't a new concept. It's just now these are making major headlines and they're in the media, and it's creating a lot of fear. But as long as you're doing everything correctly, you're not misrepresenting what you're doing or the type of work that you're performing in the United States, it should be business as usual in terms of travel.
One thing that I've been advising my clients is to make sure that from a very public-facing sort of perspective, the narrative is consistent. So if your LinkedIn profile has a very different job title and a clear mismatch between details that were reported on your underlying petition, that could certainly cause some tension and lead to extra questioning from CBP. One of our listeners asked a question. It sounds like the viewer is an Indian who has a valid H-1B approval, perhaps has been residing in India for quite some time, but has a valid visa stamp and wants to enter with that approval notice and the visa, but there's only 25 days left. So to that individual, I might expect some extra questions from CBP. If there's not an extended runway on the period of work authorization, it's not that CBP would deny that individual, but they may ask questions and make sure that the individual knows, hey, you only have 25 days to remain in the United States. What's your plan for departure? Do you have a round trip ticket? Are you really coming in to work for the employer on your petition? Maybe even perhaps do they intend to extend it? So just be prepared, know where you're going, know who you're working for. And again, think about your public facing profile and how that narrative all comes together. A longer interview and referral to secondary inspection is definitely possible. So you want to build in some extra travel time. And remember, re-entry is never guaranteed. A valid visa does not guarantee anyone admission. CBP officers have full discretion at the border, but if you are abiding by the terms of your status and underlying approval, hopefully you shouldn't have too many issues. Moving on to green card. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, I was just going to say with H-1Bs in general, there are a few documents that you can travel with that, are going to be important in the event that you do get extra screening or extra questioning at the border. So for starters, you definitely want to have your visa and your passport because you need that for entry. But also, it's not a bad idea to travel with the underlying LCA that's associated with your H-1B petition, because that's going to outline the terms and conditions of your appointment. It's the basis for that H-1B approval in the first place. And it is a document that, a CBP officer can sometimes request. So having that on your person and traveling with that is a good idea. And it's a good way to be proactive in addressing any additional questions by customs.
And always, when possible, carry that original I-797 approval notice. A copy will also technically do the job, but the original is always best to have by the applicant who's requesting entry at the border. Okay, so let's move on to green card holders. And lots of headlines, again, in the media about permanent residents being denied entry or pulled into secondary inspection, aggressively questioned. What, Zach, are some of the tipping points for these types of questions? And what do you think is going on? Should green card holders be scared to travel internationally and request re-entry to the United States?
Yeah, so with green card holders in general, you have to remember that there are some terms and conditions to your lawful permanent residence in the United States. So, you have to maintain the U.S. as your primary residence, meaning you have to spend a certain amount of time in the U.S. per year. And one of the biggest red flags to customs is going to be extended trips outside the United States as an LPR. So in general, if you spend more than 12 months consecutively outside the United States, CBP can deem your green card invalid for reentry. They'll treat you as an arriving alien. You'll have to convince the officer that you haven't abandoned your permanent residence. It can be a very difficult situation to overcome. And even trips of less than a consecutive year outside the country can raise a red flag. If you're spending, 8 or 9 months outside the U.S., but you're popping in every month or so to visit, the United States and keep your status intact, over time, this pattern of, travel outside the United States is going to become more and more evident to CBP officers when they admit you to the United States upon inspection. And, this can lead to presumptions that you've abandoned your lawful permanent resident status. And that's one of the biggest sort of tipping points or issues that you see with green card holders. But aside from that, obviously, any criminal issues, if you run into the law after your green card is issued, you could go months, even years without this ever coming up at the border. But these CBP databases and the government systems in general are always being updated. And it's just a matter of time before this information pops up on an officer's screen when you're at U.S. Customs, and it can lead to issues. So if you find yourself dealing with some sort of criminal situation, it's always going to be best to consult with an attorney and figure out if this is going to impact your status. If it is, how you can address it, and just how to address it in general when you're traveling, because this is something that seems to be coming up more and more commonly.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I want to go back to something you said about green card holders having these extended absences outside of the US. So if you have a client who received a green card and they've been happily living in the US, and then their circumstances change, maybe they have an aging parent back home abroad, or maybe they get this incredible job opportunity that they just can't pass up for a few years and they want to give it a shot and move back abroad, but not quite give up their green card. That takes years and years to get. It's not an easy thing to obtain to begin with. Are there any mechanisms that can protect their LPR status while they are spending extended time abroad?
Yeah, so you can apply for what's called a reentry permit. And a reentry permit is designed for that specific situation where you have a green card, you don't intend on abandoning your permanent residence in the United States, but maybe your circumstances have changed and you need to spend significant time outside the country. This is common for, temporary work assignments abroad, or family issues, or any personal issues that, may cause you to depart the U.S. for an extended period. And by applying for this reentry permit proactively and getting it up front before you actually depart the U.S. and spend this significant time outside the country, is a way to preserve your status and your intent of not abandoning your status. And having this reentry permit is going to sort of safeguard you from that presumption by a CBP officer that you've abandoned your LPR status.
Yes. If we have green card holder listeners who are kind of spending their time in another country alongside the U.S. or more time outside of the U.S., please consider getting a reentry permit. The government likes these types of applications. It's basically you putting the government on notice that you can't abide by the physical presence requirements or even the residency requirements that are imparted onto a lawful permanent resident. And it's letting them know, hey, I don't want to give up my green card. I am applying to temporarily spend time abroad. And it just helps facilitate your re-entry into the US after an extended period of time. But one thing to know is that you have to plan for this in advance. These applications must be applied for while the green card holder is physically present in the United States. Once the application is submitted, there is a biometrics appointment a few weeks later. So some logistics. So plan early, as in anything related to U.S. immigration. And we can certainly help you with that type of application if it's something that you're interested in. Zach, go ahead.
Just one other thing about the reentry permits is, just because you apply for it doesn't necessarily mean you have to spend a specified period of time outside the United States.
Right.
So these reentry permits can be valid for more than one trip back to the country. And it's something that you get as a precautionary measure a lot as well. Because if you anticipate spending significant time out the U.S., this is going to help safeguard your permanent residence. But if you don't end up needing it, that's not a problem either.
No harm, no foul.
So something that you want to apply for in a use it precautionary, just so that you sort of safeguard yourself and prevent future issues. Because the last thing you want is to, depart the U.S. and then have something come up, or maybe you anticipated this and then you end up spending more time abroad than you expected, and you have issues upon reentry. So just being proactive about it is going to be the best way to safeguard your status.
That's right. We're coming up towards the end of our webinar, and I see that we are getting some questions in related to Customs and Border Protection's authority to search electronic devices at the border. This is something that has been coming up alongside all of those media headlines as well. Does CBP have authority to search an electronic device, whether that's a phone, a laptop, a tablet, without the individual's consent? So we're getting lots of questions through the firm on this topic, and people seem genuinely surprised by the answer. Zach, how would you advise them?
Yeah, and for starters, they do. The short answer to that question is yes. They have the ability to search your phone, your electronic devices. They can go through your laptop. They don't need your consent to do this. This is something that has existed for a very long time, and it's something that does happen at the border. It's not the most common scenario. There's usually, some sort of aggravating factor or underlying issue that's going to lead to this type of search. But they're fully within their power to take your cell phone, read your emails, go through your text messages. And if there's anything incriminating in there, like, for example, if you've been traveling as a visitor and they take your phone, go through your email and see that you've been working in the United States, that can really lead to major immigration complications.
Also related, don't misrepresent yourself, because one, not only do we not know what exactly is in CBP's own internal systems, but if they grab your electronic device and do a search and something that they find clearly conflicts with something that you've told them, that can lead to some really serious consequences. So again, less can be more when speaking with the government, but never ever misrepresent what you've been doing or your answer to a question that is not aligned with the truth. That can also be found out.
Yeah, the worst thing you can do is lie to a CBP officer.
Yeah.
If they catch you in a lie, they can ban you for life. They can slap you with a permanent ban from re-entering the U.S. based on fraud and misrepresentation.
And there is no waiver for that type of fraud and misrepresentation when it comes to trying to lie and misrepresent yourself for an immigration benefit. So tread carefully. Another thing that we are also advising clients is to maybe check out your social media activity, because that can be reviewed during inspection, and CBP's browsing your Facebook wall. And even if you've posted content that appears politically charged, anti-American, or inflammatory, particularly perhaps against the Trump administration, that can raise red flags and be taken out of context, even if it's satire or intended as a joke. Again, remember that CBP officers have a lot of discretion about who they're willing to admit to the United States. So if in doubt, it may be wise to err on the side of caution and perhaps delete some of that older content.
Yeah, that's also just a good point about CBP in general is, speaking about erring on the side of caution, that's sort of how they operate in general as well.
Yeah.
So if they have any suspicion or any concerns, or there's any slight red flag about, what you're going to be doing in the U.S. or whether or not you're a potential risk to the United States, they have complete discretion and can absolutely refuse you entry, even if it's a ridiculous reason for doing so. So you just need to be careful. You need to be prepared when traveling.
That's right. And again, at the end of the day, remember, CBP has always had this sort of authority. This is not anything new. They have always been inspecting individuals, and their intent when any non-American citizen is requesting entry to the U.S. What we are seeing is the government turning up the dial, so to speak, on how they're doing it. We're hearing more reports about them using some more aggressive tactics or deeper lines of questioning. So again, as Zach has mentioned several times throughout this webinar, be prepared, prepare in advance, think about your activity, know the details of where you're going, and have some confident answers to respond to when you are requesting entry. Again, thank you for tuning in. Zach, any parting comments before we wrap this up?
Yeah, just back to what I said initially, there's definitely a lot of media coverage about U.S. immigration. And for those that have done everything correctly, for those that continue to do everything correctly, this isn't something that should persuade you from pursuing another work permit or pursuing permanent residence in the United States, because as long as you do it appropriately and you're doing everything according to the law, it's a situation that you're going to be able to continue doing this. A lot of these media stories and all of these headlines can be misleading. They're meant to cause fear, and that's what they're doing, but they're not always telling you the full story. So if you ever have questions, or if you're ever interested in learning more about some potential U.S. immigration options, we're the best people to contact. That's
right. Follow along on our YouTube channel. We are very busy and active on social media, including Facebook and LinkedIn. Thank you all for tuning in, and stay tuned for some additional webinar announcements and dates for other immigration topics coming soon. Have a good afternoon and enjoy the rest of your week.